When Rome fell and shadows rose over Britain, when the last embers of the Roman Empire began to fade, the end did not arrive with the thunder of battle or the collapse of cities, but with a long, uncertain silence. Across the mist-laden fields and valleys of Britain, an eerie stillness replaced the ordered rhythm of Roman life. The eagle standards that had once gleamed against the northern sky were gone, the legions recalled to defend the dying empire. In their absence, Britain stood abandoned, an island adrift between two worlds, the civilization that had nurtured it and the wilderness waiting to reclaim it. For 4 centuries, the Romans had brought roads, law, and language to this distant province. They had carved out towns from forest and marsh, built temples and fortresses, and woven their empire into the very fabric of daily life. But now, as the Roman world fractured, the people of Britain were left without guidance, unsure whether to look to the past or face the uncertain dawn that approached from beyond the horizon. The collapse of Rome did not simply erase an empire. It unraveled an entire way of being. The Romanized Britons, who had once lived under the protection of the legions, found themselves surrounded by rising tides of chaos. Trade routes that had connected them to the wider Mediterranean world vanished. Cities that had thrived for centuries were reduced to shells of their former selves. The familiar sound of Latin prayers faded, replaced by the fearful whispers of a people who no longer knew where salvation might come from. And from across the cold gray waters of the North Sea, shadows began to move, the first stirrings of a new age. They came in narrow wooden ships, guided by the stars and the memory of winds. They were the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, warrior peoples from the northern coasts of Europe, hardened by centuries of struggle and the endless fight for survival. To the Britons, these strangers were not merely foreigners. They were forces of nature, people who seemed carved from the same wild elements that shaped the storms. They spoke in strange tongues, carried the thunder of war in their chants, and followed gods no Roman priest had ever named. They worshipped Woden, Thunder, and Ti, deities of strength and fate, and they carried with them not the laws of empire, but the unyielding code of the warrior. At first, they came as mercenaries, hired swords, called upon by desperate chieftains who could no longer defend their lands from the constant raids of northern tribes. Yet as history so often teaches, those invited to guard the gates often become their masters. What began as alliances soon turned into occupations. The mercenaries realized that this island, fertile and fractured, was ripe for conquest. Its people were divided, its leaders unsure, and its defenses crumbling. Slowly, villages once ruled by Romano-British nobles became Saxon settlements. Roman villas, abandoned and decaying, found new life as the halls of warrior chiefs. The transition was not sudden, nor was it uniform. Across Britain, old and new worlds collided in countless ways, in battle, in trade, in marriage, and in myth. Rome's legacy did not vanish overnight. It lingered in the ruins, in the language, and in the faint memory of order. But something new was taking shape, something neither wholly Roman nor entirely foreign, a fusion of cultures that would one day be known as English. The world of early post-Roman Britain was not a world of clarity. It was a world of twilight, where the boundaries between faith and superstition, civilization and savagery, were blurred beyond recognition. To walk through the land in those days was to move through layers of time, past Roman roads that led nowhere, past crumbling temples now overtaken by moss, past standing stones older than memory itself. The air carried the weight of uncertainty, yet within that uncertainty was the pulse of transformation. The warrior peoples who came to Britain did not merely destroy, they also built. They brought their own customs, languages, and ways of life, and in the centuries to come, their descendants would forge a new identity from the ashes of what Rome had left behind. It is tempting to imagine this as a simple story of invasion, of barbarians sweeping in to conquer a civilized land. But history rarely conforms to such simplicity. The truth was more complex, more human. Migration, after all, is as much about survival as it is about conquest. The Angles and Saxons did not see themselves as invaders, but as settlers, carving out homes in a land that seemed both alien and promised. Their children would grow up on British soil, their tongues adapting to new sounds, their gods slowly giving way to new faiths. And so, without design or declaration, a new civilization began to take root. In the stillness of those early years, amid the ruins of empire, one could almost hear the world shifting. The Roman world had been a world of roads and laws, of boundaries marked and borders defined. The new world rising in its place was rougher, more uncertain, but also alive with possibility. The warrior chiefs who now ruled small territories could scarcely imagine that their petty kingdoms would one day be remembered as the foundations of England. They were simply trying to survive, to lead their people through an age of hunger, fear, and constant change. Yet in doing so, they were laying the groundwork for something far greater than themselves. If you stood then on the coast of Kent, watching the sun fade behind the waves, you might have seen a small band of Saxon warriors pulling their ships onto the sand. To them, this was the edge of the known world, a place of mystery and danger, but also hope. They would build fires, sharpen their blades, and speak of home in low voices. None of them could have known that they stood at the threshold of a civilization that would one day command half the globe. For now, all that mattered was the land before them, the soil beneath their feet, and the promise that somewhere within this mist-covered island lay the chance to begin again. History is rarely kind to its beginnings. The early centuries of what would become England were marked by violence, uncertainty, and loss. Yet from that chaos came a slow, steady transformation. The Romans had brought structure and order. The new peoples brought resilience and renewal. Together, though separated by generations, they formed the backbone of a nation that would one day call itself a kingdom, then an empire, and finally, a story told to the world. This was how it began, not with triumph, not with clarity, but with a quiet endurance born from the ruins of the past. When the legions left and the light of Rome dimmed, Britain did not vanish. It changed. And in that change, in the meeting of storm and soil, of sword and spirit, a new people began to emerge, a people who would give their name to the land itself. The Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, wanderers, warriors, and settlers, came not merely to conquer, but to belong. And from their long struggle for survival, they would forge something that would endure for millennia. The fall of Rome was not the end of civilization in Britain. It was, in truth, the beginning of another. A civilization that would rise quietly from the mists, shaped by the will of a warrior people, and tempered by the memory of all that had been lost. The coming of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, the winds that blew across the North Sea in the 5th century, carried more than salt and cold. They carried destiny. In the lands that would one day be called Denmark, northern Germany, and southern Scandinavia, life was a daily struggle between man and nature. The soil was thin, the winters long, and survival was never guaranteed. Generations of people had learned to read the moods of the sea and the whispers of the forest, to draw strength from hardship and pride from endurance. These were the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, peoples bound not by empire or king, but by clan, blood, and the unyielding belief that courage was the measure of a man. They lived close to the elements, in villages of timber and thatch, where the hearth fire was both protection and symbol, the heart of every home, and the echo of a people's spirit. To these northern tribes, the sea was not a barrier, it was a road. They looked upon its rolling expanse, not with fear, but with a kind of reverence. It separated them from the wider world, yet it also offered escape, the promise of land, wealth, and freedom. For centuries they had sailed its coasts, raiding, trading, and exploring. Their long, narrow boats, carved through oak and guided by instinct, became extensions of their will. When the stories began to spread of a great island to the west, rich in forests, rivers, and open land, it was not long before the restless among them turned their eyes toward it. Some came as mercenaries, summoned by British chieftains desperate for help against marauding Picts and Scots. Others came simply because the horizon called to them. The first ships that crossed the sea were small, their sails patched, their crews uncertain of what awaited them. But what they found was a land that seemed made for settlement. Fertile valleys, wide plains, and rivers that carried the scent of promise. The Roman towns still stood in ruin, and the once busy roads lay silent, overgrown with weeds. The native Britons, still reeling from the collapse of Roman order, were fragmented and weary. And so, slowly at first, then with gathering force, the newcomers began to take root. They built wooden halls on the high ground, cleared forests for farmland, and named their new homes after the clans who ruled them. Kent, Sussex, Wessex, Essex, these names would one day define kingdoms, but in their beginnings, they were simply markers of belonging. The relationship between the Britons and the newcomers was uneasy from the start. At first, they coexisted, bound by fragile agreements and mutual need. But such alliances were built on shifting sand. As more settlers arrived, hunger and ambition replaced cooperation. Clashes broke out, first as skirmishes, then as full-scale wars. The native leaders who had once thought to use the Saxons as shields found themselves driven from their lands, retreating into the western hills and the mountains of Wales. To the Britons, the newcomers were invaders. To the Saxons and Angles, they were liberators, reclaiming a world that had been abandoned by Rome and left to decay. Each migration wave reshaped the landscape, not only through conquest, but through culture. The newcomers brought with them a language that was harsh and beautiful, filled with the rhythms of the sea and the forest. They had no written script, only oral traditions, sagas sung around firelight, tales of heroes who defied death and gods who shaped the fates of men. In time, these stories would blend with the older Celtic myths of Britain, giving rise to a rich and complex heritage. Yet in these early years, life was still raw, defined by survival and struggle. For the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, identity was rooted in the warrior's code. Honor was everything. A man's worth was measured not by wealth or land, but by his bravery in battle and his loyalty to his lord. Their society was tribal and communal, structured around kinship and obligation. The leader, or sinning, was both war chief and protector, bound to his men by gift and oath. The warrior, or thane, swore to fight to the death for his lord's cause, and in return received not only rewards, but a place in song and memory. Death in battle was not feared, but revered, a gateway to the hall of ancestors, where the brave would feast forever under the watchful eye of their gods. As more ships arrived, these scattered bands grew into organized communities. Villages became territories, territories became kingdoms, and with each generation, the newcomers grew less like wanderers and more like natives. They intermarried with the local Britons, adopted elements of their customs, and gradually forged a new shared identity. The lines between conqueror and conquered began to blur. In the ashes of war, a new culture was being born, not Roman, not Celtic, not purely Germanic, but something entirely its own. This was the slow and silent birth of the English people. But the transition was not peaceful. Entire generations knew nothing but conflict. The wars of the 5th and 6th centuries were brutal, personal, and endless. Armies fought not for empires, but for honor, survival, and soil. The chronicles speak of burning towns, of rivers running red, of kings who rose and fell in the span of a single season. Yet even amid destruction, there was growth. Fields were cleared, Trade began to flow once more, and the fragments of old Britain were being reshaped into something new. The Roman villas might have crumbled, but in their place stood timber halls filled with laughter, music, and the scent of roasted meat, the heartbeats of a civilization rediscovering itself. The coming of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes was not merely an invasion, it was a transformation. They did not simply replace one world with another. They merged it, layer by layer, until the boundaries between past and present became indistinguishable. The Latin prayers of the old priests mingled with the chants of pagan rituals. The ruins of Roman temples became sites of new worship. Even the land itself seemed to breathe differently, as if awakening to its own rebirth. And through it all, the newcomers saw themselves not as destroyers, but as heirs, claiming a destiny that fate itself seemed to have written upon the waves. By the time the 7th century dawned, the once fragmented settlements had grown into kingdoms. In the south, the Jutes ruled Kent, their capital rising near the shores where their ancestors had first landed. To the east, the Saxons built their realms of Essex, Sussex, and Wessex, each with its own proud line of kings. And in the north, the Angles carved out the lands of Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia, vast territories that would become the backbone of early England. Though they fought among themselves as fiercely as they fought others, they shared a common spirit, the belief that strength, loyalty, and courage could forge order from chaos. If one were to walk through these kingdoms in their infancy, one would find a land alive with contrasts: war and peace, faith and fear, loss and rebirth. The people built their homes from wood, but their dreams from legend. They farmed by day, fought by night, and found meaning in the stories that connected them to their ancestors. They believed that the world was held together by oaths, not the written laws of Rome, but the spoken promises of men. To break an oath was to shatter one's soul. To die for one's word was to become immortal. It is here, in these centuries of hardship and hope, that the foundation of England was truly laid, not in marble halls or imperial decrees, but in the sweat and soil of common people, in the courage of warriors who had crossed an unforgiving sea, and in the quiet endurance of those who called this island home. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes did not set out to build a nation. They sought only survival, yet in their struggle they gave birth to something far greater than themselves. They could not have known that their descendants would one day shape language, law, and culture for the entire world. They could not have foreseen the cathedrals, the poems, or the empires that would spring from their legacy. But every nation begins somewhere, and England began here in the roar of the sea, the clash of the sword, and the whisper of firelight in the dark. The rise of the early kingdoms, when the smoke of endless battles began to thin, the land that had once been fractured by war started to breathe again. Out of the ashes of chaos rose the first kingdoms of what would one day be called England. They were not born in marble courts or decreed by distant emperors. They grew from the soil itself, nurtured by the blood, sweat, and stubborn endurance of those who tilled, fought, and built upon it. Each kingdom carried the memory of its people, their origins across the North Sea, their struggles against the old Britons, and their relentless drive to shape order from the wilderness. It began in the south, where the Jutes had established their hold over Kent. There, in the green valleys near the mouth of the Thames, they built their settlements, sturdy wooden halls surrounded by fields and palisades. From these humble beginnings emerged a kingdom that would become a model for others. Kent was not vast, but it was organized, prosperous, and open to the outside world. Trade routes reached across the Channel to the Franks and Gaul, and with them came new ideas, goods, and even faith. The kings of Kent were among the first to blend Germanic vigor with continental sophistication. They ruled not only by strength of arms, but by the delicate art of alliance. The chronicles would later remember them as the first to accept Christianity, and in doing so, they set in motion changes that would ripple across every future kingdom. To the west and south, the Saxons were expanding their influence. The kingdom of Wessex began as little more than a collection of warrior tribes, united by loyalty to a strong leader. But over time, they grew into a power that stretched deep into the heart of the island. Their kings were pragmatic men, warriors first, but also builders, lawgivers, and visionaries. They learned quickly that to hold land was not enough. One had to govern it. In the markets and meeting halls of early Wessex, the seeds of a new kind of rule were being sown. One based not only on conquest, but on the idea of shared identity. Farther north, the Angles carved their realms into the rolling landscapes of Mercia and Northumbria. These were lands of forests, rivers, and open plains, vast and untamed, but rich with potential. Mercia, whose very name meant the border people, grew into a kingdom defined by its ambition. It stood at the heart of the island, touching the lands of every other realm, and its kings saw themselves as the natural leaders of all. They waged wars not merely for survival, but for dominance, forging alliances and breaking them with equal ease. Under rulers like Penda, Mercia became both feared and respected, a kingdom whose power reached far beyond its borders. Northumbria, meanwhile, became something else entirely. It was a realm of contrasts, wild and rugged, yet deeply spiritual. Its kings were warriors, but they also became patrons of learning and art. In the monasteries of Lindisfarne and Jarrow, monks illuminated manuscripts that would one day inspire the entire Christian world. There, amid the howling winds of the northern coasts, men wrote not of war, but of wonder, of God, of destiny, and of the fragile beauty of life. Northumbria's greatness was not only measured in territory, but in thought. It was here that England began to find its soul. But these early kingdoms were not peaceful. They fought as often against each other as they did against outsiders. The idea of a unified England was still centuries away, and power was a game played with blood. Rival kings rose and fell like waves against the shore. Betrayal was common, vengeance expected. Yet within this endless struggle, something remarkable was happening. A shared culture was beginning to emerge. Across the island, people who once spoke in scattered dialects were now speaking a common tongue. Traditions, once local and isolated, were becoming woven into a single tapestry. The people who had arrived as Angles, Saxons, and Jutes were slowly becoming something new, the English. The growth of these kingdoms was not only political, but deeply cultural. They built great wooden halls, the centers of both feasting and governance, where kings and warriors gathered to celebrate victories and settle disputes. The firelight in these halls flickered against carved beams. Illuminating shields hung as trophies and spears resting against the walls. Skalds the storytellers sang of heroes and battles, of gods who walked among men and men who became legends. These stories were not mere entertainment. They were the threads that bound a people together. In a world without written laws, myth carried the weight of truth. In Kent, Christianity began to take root, carried across the sea by missionaries from Rome and Gaul. The arrival of St. Augustine in 597 A.D. marked a turning point, not just for religion, but for identity. For the first time since the fall of Rome, Britain was reconnecting with the wider world. Monks brought books, music, and architecture. Churches began to rise beside pagan temples. And slowly, a new faith began to mingle with the old. The conversion was not forced, but gradual, a conversation rather than a conquest. The old gods of the forest, the sea, and the sky did not vanish overnight. They lingered in the stories and traditions of the people, blending with the Christian saints and symbols that replaced them. The result was not division, but fusion, a uniquely English spirituality, born of both heaven and earth. The kingdoms also began to codify their customs. Laws, once spoken and remembered, were now written down, the first step toward governance by record rather than by memory. These early codes reflected the values of their time: honor, loyalty, and compensation. Justice was personal. Wrongs were righted not through imprisonment, but through restitution. A man's worth, measured in gold or cattle, was set by his status, yet beneath the surface was a growing sense that order, not mere power, was the foundation of civilization. Trade flourished once more. Markets sprang up along rivers and coastlines, where merchants exchanged goods from distant lands, glass from Gaul, wine from the Mediterranean, furs from the north. The economy was small but growing, and for the first time in generations, prosperity began to replace desperation. With wealth came art. Craftsmen fashioned intricate jewelry, weapons adorned with silver and gold, and textiles woven with care. The designs combined native Celtic patterns with Germanic boldness and Christian symbolism, a reflection of a people still finding themselves amid the merging of worlds. In every hall, in every settlement, one could feel a quiet confidence emerging. The invasions were over, the wars of survival giving way to wars of ambition. These early kingdoms were not yet unified, but they were beginning to recognize their shared destiny. The English landscape, once a patchwork of tribes and ruins, was now a living map of power and purpose. And yet, for all their progress, these rulers could not foresee the challenges that awaited them beyond the horizon. Challenges that would test not just their armies, but the very soul of what they were building. The 7th and 8th centuries were an age of kings, men whose names still echo through time. Ethelbert of Kent, Edwin of Northumbria, Oswald the Blessed, and Offa of Mercia. Each carved his legacy in a different way. Ethelbert's reign brought faith, Edwin's brought unity, Oswald's brought sanctity, and Offa's brought might. It was Offa who built the great dike that still bears his name, a massive earthwork stretching across the Welsh border, both a boundary and a statement. It declared to the world that Mercia stood as a power equal to any. Yet even Offa, with all his wealth and vision, could not unite the kingdoms for long. After his death, the fragile balance began to crumble, and new forces, both foreign and divine, prepared to enter the story. By the end of the 8th century, the kingdoms of England had reached a kind of uneasy maturity. They had their laws, their faith, their art, and their pride. They had learned to govern, to trade, and to dream. But just as they began to taste stability, a new storm gathered over the northern seas. Across the cold waters of Scandinavia, another people were stirring, fierce, driven, and fearless. They would come not to settle, but to plunder, not to blend, but to conquer. The English, who had once been the invaders, were about to become the invaded. For now, though, the land rested in a fragile peace. In the halls of kings, feasts were held. In the monasteries, prayers were sung. In the villages, life went on, simple, harsh, and beautiful. No one could yet know that this peace was merely the calm before the storm, the brief pause between the forging of a nation and the fire that would test it. The rise of the early kingdoms was not just the story of power, but of identity. It was the slow awakening of a people who had endured the collapse of Rome, the terror of invasion, and the chaos of rebuilding. From those trials, they had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that civilization is not built in a generation, but in the quiet persistence of countless lives. Every plowed field, every sung hymn, every oath spoken beneath the flicker of torchlight was a step towards something greater. The English were no longer a collection of tribes. They were becoming a civilization, and soon they would discover just how much that civilization could endure. The coming of the Northmen. There are moments in history when the world seems to hold its breath, just before everything changes. For the people of the early English kingdoms, the late 8th century was such a time. The fields were full, the monasteries alive with song, and the memory of conquest was beginning to fade into the comfort of routine. And then, on a quiet June morning in the year 793, the horizon darkened. Long sleek ships appeared off the coast of Northumbria, cutting through the sea like blades. The men who came ashore that day were strangers, tall, fierce, and clad in furs and iron. They spoke a language harsh and unfamiliar, and their arrival would mark the beginning of an age of terror, an age of transformation. The Northmen had come. To the monks of Lindisfarne, it must have seemed like the end of the world. Their island monastery, a sanctuary of prayer and peace, had stood for generations as a beacon of faith and learning. But that morning, the sea itself betrayed them. The invaders stormed the shores, their axes flashing in the sunlight. They looted the holy relics, tore down the crosses, and left the ground red with blood. Survivors fled in horror, and word of the attack spread across the island like wildfire. The shock was immense. The English had believed themselves protected by both God and the sea, yet the sea had carried their destroyers to them. The chronicles of the time record the event with trembling awe. Terrible portents appeared over Northumbria. Whirlwinds, flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. To those who lived through it, the attack on Lindisfarne was not just a raid, it was divine punishment. The faithful saw it as a sign that the sins of kings and the greed of men had drawn the wrath of heaven. But in truth, it was not wrath that came from the north. It was ambition, hunger, and the restless spirit of a people born in harsh lands, driven by the need to survive and the desire to explore. The Norsemen, whom the English would come to call Vikings, were not demons, though they often seemed so to those who faced them. They were farmers and fishermen, traders and poets, as well as warriors. In the fjords of Norway and the coasts of Denmark, life was a constant battle against the elements. Land was scarce, winters long, and the sea offered both danger and opportunity. From these conditions arose a culture of extraordinary resilience, a people unafraid of death, who believed that glory won in battle could echo beyond the grave. Their gods rewarded courage and scorned weakness, and so they lived by the sword, their longships carrying them across the known world. The first Viking raids on England were small, fast, brutal, and focused on plunder. Monasteries were easy targets, rich in gold and silver, poorly defended, and isolated along the coast. The invaders struck without warning, vanishing as quickly as they came. To the English, these attacks seemed almost supernatural, but over time the pattern became clear. The Northmen were not content with gold alone. As the years passed, their raids grew bolder, their numbers larger. They began to winter on English soil, building camps and fortresses. What had begun as raiding soon turned into something far more permanent: invasion. The kingdoms of England were slow to respond. Divided and often at war with one another, they could not easily unite against this new enemy. Northumbria suffered first. Its proud monasteries and towns burned. Then came East Anglia, whose king, Edmund, would meet a tragic fate. The Vikings demanded his submission, but he refused to renounce his faith. Captured and tied to a tree, he was shot with arrows until his body bristled like a hedgehog. His martyrdom would make him a saint, but his death marked the fall of his kingdom. In 865, the nature of the Viking threat changed forever. A massive army landed on English shores, not a raiding party, but a host bent on conquest. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called it the Great Heathen Army. It was led by legendary figures whose names would echo through history: Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba, sons of the fabled Ragnar Lothbrok. They came to avenge their father's death and to claim new lands for their people. Their armies swept through England with terrifying efficiency. Northumbria fell. East Anglia fell. Mercia was forced to make peace. One by one, the great kingdoms that had risen from the ashes of the Roman collapse were brought to their knees. And yet, amid the ruin, one kingdom endured. In the south, the men of Wessex watched as the world around them burned. Their young king, Alfred, would soon find himself facing an enemy unlike any his ancestors had known. But before that moment came, the Vikings would carve their mark into the land and into the souls of its people. Their presence changed everything: the way the English fought, the way they built, even the way they prayed. The Vikings were not merely destroyers. As they settled, they brought with them their own customs, laws, and artistry. Towns like York, or Jorvik, as they called it, became bustling centers of trade, where English and Norse lived side by side. Craftsmen shaped silver into bracelets and brooches of intricate design, blending the interlaced patterns of Norse art with the elegance of Anglo-Saxon style. Words from their language slipped into English speech, simple, everyday words like sky, egg, knife, and window. These were not the gifts of conquest alone. They were the marks of cultural fusion, the slow merging of two worlds. But the coming of the Northmen was also a test, one that would define England's future. The English had faced invaders before, but never like this. The Romans had ruled with order. The Saxons had conquered to settle. The Vikings, by contrast, came in waves, unpredictable, ruthless, and unstoppable. Their ships struck from the sea like ghosts, and no coast was safe. Even those who paid tribute found little peace, for greed knows no boundaries. The English response was shaped by desperation and ingenuity. Fortified towns, called burhs, began to appear, defensive strongholds where villagers could retreat during raids. These were not grand castles, but earthworks and palisades, simple yet effective. They would later form the backbone of Alfred's strategy, but their origins lay here, in this age of chaos. To the monks and chroniclers, the Viking Age was a nightmare. The poems they wrote spoke of smoke rising from burning churches, of mothers weeping over slain children, of a land drenched in sorrow. Yet even in their grief, they recorded something else, a strange admiration. The Northmen's courage, their seamanship, their skill in battle, these qualities were undeniable. Over time, fear gave way to respect, and respect to reluctant kinship. By the late 9th century, the Vikings were no longer just raiders, they were settlers. Across the north and east of England, their influence spread. They established the Danelaw, a region governed by their own laws and customs, distinct from the rest of the kingdom. Here, Norse earls ruled English peasants, and the two cultures intertwined. Pagan temples stood beside Christian churches, and the lines between conqueror and conquered began to blur. The transformation was profound. The invasion that had begun in blood was slowly giving birth to something new, a hybrid world where Norse strength met English endurance. The very identity of the island was being reforged, tempered by war, but not broken. And yet, as the 9th century drew to a close, one question remained. Could the English ever be truly free again? The great heathen army had conquered nearly all the land. Only Wessex still stood. Its people, weary but unyielding, gathered behind their king, a man whose name would soon become legend, Alfred. But before Alfred could save England, he would first have to survive it. His kingdom was small, his army exhausted, his faith tested to its limits. The Viking tide had swept across the island, and it seemed unstoppable. Yet history has a strange rhythm. Just when all appears lost, a spark can ignite in the darkness, a spark that can light the way for centuries to come. For the English, that spark was about to be born. Alfred and the fire of resistance. There are few figures in history who rise from the ashes of despair to become symbols of hope, and fewer still who manage to reshape an entire nation's destiny through sheer will, intellect, and faith. In the dark years of the late 9th century, as England trembled under the shadow of the Viking conquest, one such figure emerged, a man born not into glory, but into chaos. His name was Alfred. History would later call him Alfred the Great. But when his story began, he was simply a young prince of Wessex, standing at the edge of a kingdom about to fall apart. Alfred was not the eldest son of King Ethelwulf, and few expected him to rule. His childhood was marked by war and uncertainty. The Vikings had already begun their relentless march across the island, consuming kingdoms like waves devouring sandcastles. He grew up watching the great Anglo-Saxon realms, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, collapse one by one. Each time a new stronghold fell, the survivors fled south, carrying stories of horror, loss, and defiance. By the time the enemy's sails appeared off the southern coast, Wessex stood alone, the last refuge of the old English way of life. When Alfred became king in 871, the weight of the entire island rested on his shoulders. His coronation was not a moment of celebration, but of grim necessity. The land was ravaged, the people exhausted, and the Viking armies, led by men like Guthrum and Ubba, were stronger than ever. Alfred inherited not a kingdom, but a question. Could England still exist? His early years as king were brutal. The Vikings struck fast and hard, launching campaigns that seemed endless. Alfred's forces won some battles, but for every victory there were crushing defeats. In 878, the storm finally broke. The Danes launched a surprise attack in the dead of winter, catching Alfred's army unprepared. His court scattered, his fortresses burned, and his people surrendered or fled. The King of Wessex became a fugitive in his own land, driven into the marshes of Somerset, cold, hungry, and hunted. For a time, it seemed as if the story of England had ended. Chroniclers would later describe Alfred's exile as a season of despair, when even the bravest hearts faltered. He took refuge among the reeds and mists, living as a shadow, watching the smoke of Viking encampments rise from the hills. There, in the silence of the swamps, he faced the full weight of failure, not as a king, but as a man. And yet, something happened in those lonely months. The man who had been forced into hiding began to see beyond the ruins of his kingdom. In the cold stillness of the marshes, Alfred's vision took shape. He realized that the Viking onslaught could not be stopped by swords alone. England needed more than warriors. It needed ideas, organization, faith, and unity. The Danes were fierce, but they were not invincible. Their strength lay in chaos. Alfred would fight them with order. The legends tell a story, perhaps apocryphal, yet symbolic, of Alfred and the burnt cakes. It is said that during his exile, he was given shelter by a peasant woman who did not recognize her guest as the king. She left him to watch her bread as it baked, while she went about her chores. Lost in thought about the fate of his kingdom, Alfred let the bread burn, and the woman scolded him harshly for his carelessness. The story is simple, almost trivial, but in it lies a powerful truth. Even kings can fall, and even in failure, humility can spark renewal. From that humiliation, Alfred rose with a new resolve. Slowly, he began to gather his scattered followers. Messages were sent through the forests and across the hills. The king was alive, and England was not yet lost. Farmers, soldiers, and priests came to his side. They met in secret, praying, planning, and waiting for their moment. That moment came in the spring of 878, when Alfred led his men to a place called Edington. There, against the army of Guthrum, he made his stand. The two forces met in a furious clash of shield and spear, the fate of Wessex hanging in the balance. The chroniclers tell us that Alfred fought not as a distant monarch, but as a warrior among his men, rallying them with his presence and his faith. The battle was long and savage, but in the end, the English prevailed. Guthrum's army was broken, and the Viking leader himself was forced to surrender. Yet Alfred did something remarkable, something few kings would have done in his place. He did not execute Guthrum, nor did he enslave his men. Instead, he offered peace. Guthrum was baptized into Christianity, taking the name Athelstan, with Alfred standing as his godfather. The two rulers divided the land. The north and east remained under Viking control as the Danelaw, while Wessex and its allies held the south and west. It was a fragile peace, but it gave England time to breathe, and for Alfred, time to rebuild. What followed was one of the most extraordinary transformations in early medieval history. Alfred understood that victory on the battlefield was meaningless without the strength to preserve it. He reorganized the army, establishing a system of rotating service so that half his men could fight while the other half farmed. He built fortified towns, burhs, at key points across the kingdom, each carefully placed within a day's march of the next. These burhs were more than military defenses. They became centers of trade, law, and learning, the seeds of future English towns. He also turned his mind to the sea, recognizing that the Vikings' power lay in their ships. So Alfred built his own fleet, larger and faster than the enemy's, laying the foundations of what would one day become the English Navy. For the first time, the English fought the Norse on equal terms at sea. The chroniclers say that Alfred himself oversaw the design of the ships, blending the best of Norse and Frankish craftsmanship. It was innovation born of necessity, and it worked. But perhaps Alfred's greatest achievement was not military at all. It was intellectual. He believed that ignorance was as dangerous to a nation as any foreign invader. The long years of war had left England not only scarred, but also illiterate. Knowledge, once preserved in the monasteries, had been scattered or lost. Alfred saw education as the key to rebuilding both faith and identity. He began to translate important Latin texts into Old English, so that his people, not just the clergy, but the nobles and even common folk, could learn from them. He invited scholars from across Europe to his court, turning Wessex into a beacon of learning in a dark age. He wrote laws, too, not as decrees of power, but as moral foundations, drawing from the Bible, from Old English customs, and from Roman precedent. Alfred sought to create a kingdom governed by both justice and mercy. He saw himself not merely as a ruler, but as a shepherd of souls. His words still resonate. I desired to live worthily as long as I lived, and after my life to leave to those who should come after me a remembrance of me and good works. Under his reign, England began to rise from the ruins. Trade revived, villages grew, and churches were rebuilt. The idea of a single English nation, England, began to take root. The boundaries were still uncertain, and danger still loomed beyond the Danelaw. But for the first time in generations, there was hope. Alfred ruled for nearly 30 years, through hardship and renewal, through battle and peace. When he died in 899, he left behind more than a kingdom. He left a legacy. The network of burhs, the reformed army, the laws, the schools, all would become the foundation upon which future kings would build. And though he could not live to see it, the England he imagined, unified, resilient, and self-aware, would one day emerge from the fragments he had gathered. To his people, Alfred was more than a king. He was the embodiment of endurance, proof that from the ashes of despair, strength can rise again. His reign marked the turning point of a story that had begun with invasion and chaos, but was now slowly turning toward unity and rebirth. And yet, the peace he built was fragile. Beyond the borders of Wessex, the Vikings still ruled vast territories, and their hunger for conquest was far from satisfied. The next generation would inherit both Alfred's dream and his unfinished struggle. The question remained, could the fragile alliance of English kingdoms survive the next storm that was coming? Because history, as always, was not done with England. The sons of Alfred and the dream of a unified England. When King Alfred the Great breathed his last in 899, he left behind more than a kingdom, he left behind a vision. The world he had struggled to hold together was still fractured, still vulnerable, and yet there was something new in the air, a sense that the people who had once been scattered among the ashes of war were beginning to see themselves as part of something larger than tribe or territory. Alfred had fought not merely for survival, but for identity, and it was now the task of his children to turn that identity into a living, breathing nation. His son, Edward the Elder, and his daughter, Thelfold, the Lady of the Mercians, stood at the edge of a new era. The question was whether they could carry their father's fragile dream forward or see it crumble under the weight of division and invasion once again. Edward was not the kind of ruler who burned himself into legend through dramatic gestures or poetic victories. He lacked the mythic aura of his father, but compensated with steady resolve and quiet strength. Where Alfred had inspired through intellect and faith, Edward ruled through discipline and endurance. His reign began in uncertainty. The peace Alfred had built was fragile, and the Viking lords of the Danelaw, those Norse rulers who had settled in East Anglia, Northumbria, and the Midlands still held vast territories that cut through the heart of England. They had come as conquerors, but many now saw themselves as settlers, with farms, families, and a future rooted in the very land they had once sought to plunder. The line between foreign invader and native inhabitant had begun to blur, and that made Edward's task both more complicated and more profound. To secure his rule, Edward relied heavily on the defensive network his father had created, the burhs, or fortified towns, that formed a chain of protection across Wessex. But Edward was not content with defense. He understood that the only true safety for his people would come through unity, and unity could not exist while half the land still bowed to Viking law. So he began a slow, deliberate campaign of expansion, extending the burh system into Mercia and beyond. Each new fortress was not just a military base. It was a statement of permanence, a declaration that this land belonged to the English. Trade routes flourished between them, markets revived, and a sense of order began to take hold where chaos had once reigned. Yet Edward was not alone in this mission. In Mercia, his sister Thelfold proved herself one of the most remarkable leaders of the early Middle Ages. Married to Thellard, the ruler of Mercia, she had long acted as her husband's political partner. When his health declined, she took command, an extraordinary step for a woman in the 9th century. She was not a queen in title, but she governed as one in practice. Known affectionately and reverently as the Lady of the Mercians, Thelfold became a force of both intellect and courage. She oversaw the construction of new burhs at key frontier points, Tamworth, Stafford, and Chester among them, turning Mercia into a formidable bulwark against the Danelaw. Ethelflaud's leadership was grounded in both military strategy and diplomacy. She forged alliances, secured loyalty through pragmatic governance, and inspired deep devotion among her people. Chronicles tell us that warriors followed her not out of obligation, but respect, and that even the hardened Norsemen spoke of her with admiration. Her rule challenged the conventions of her time, proving that authority was not bound by gender, but by character and vision. Together, Edward and Thelfold represented the twin pillars of a new English identity. Wessex and Mercia once rival kingdoms, now worked in harmony, bound not by conquest, but by cooperation. Their armies launched coordinated campaigns to reclaim lost towns from Viking control. One by one, key settlements fell. Oxford, Derby, Leicester, and others returned to English rule. These victories were not the result of dramatic, sweeping battles, but of patience, strategy, and endurance. The English were no longer fighting merely to repel invaders. They were fighting to rebuild their world. As the political landscape shifted, so too did the language of power. Royal charters began to speak not only of the kingdom of the West Saxons, but of the English people. This subtle change marked a revolution in thought. For centuries, identity in these lands had been tribal West Saxon, Mercian, Northumbrian, but now there was a new consciousness taking shape, a shared sense of belonging that transcended geography. The word England was beginning to take root, not just as a name, but as an idea. In 918, tragedy struck with the death of Thelfold at Tamworth. Her loss was deeply felt across Mercia, where she had become almost mythic in her lifetime. Chroniclers wrote of her wisdom, her bravery, and her devotion to the cause her father had begun. Edward moved swiftly to ensure the continuation of her legacy, bringing Mercia under his direct rule. This was not an act of aggression, but of consolidation. For the first time, the two great English realms, Wessex in the south and Mercia in the heartland, stood united under one crown. It was a moment of quiet transformation, the kind of moment that rarely makes it into the annals of drama, but defines the course of history all the same. Edward's later years were marked by expansion and stabilization. His forces pushed farther north, reclaiming lands from the Viking jarls and bringing them into the growing English domain. Each victory extended the reach of English law, trade, and faith. When he died in 924, he left behind a kingdom stronger and more unified than any that had existed since the Romans had marched these lands. His achievement was not the work of a conqueror, but of a builder, a man who understood that the power of a kingdom lay not just in its swords, but in its structure. The legacy of Edward and Ethelfald was monumental, even if they could not have known it. Together, they had laid the groundwork for the first true English nation, one that would soon come into being under Edward's son, Athelstan. But before that story begins, it is worth reflecting on how extraordinary this transformation truly was. Only a few generations earlier, the island had been a shattered collection of warring kingdoms, ravaged by raids and near collapse. The Vikings had not only burned towns, they had burned away the illusion of permanence. And yet, from that devastation, a new order was born. Alfred had given his children the blueprint of survival, but they turned it into a vision of unity. The fortresses they built, the alliances they forged, the identity they nurtured, these became the invisible architecture of England. What emerged in the early 10th century was not a coincidence of politics, but a culmination of will, strategy, and belief. The idea of England, once a fragile dream whispered in exile, was now embedded in its very soil. And yet, this was still only the beginning. Beyond the Humber lay the old Norse strongholds of Northumbria, where Viking kings ruled with shifting loyalties and hard steel. To the north, the Scots watched warily, and to the west, the Welsh remembered their ancient independence. The unity Alfred had dreamed of was real, but it was not yet complete. The task of turning that fragile unity into empire would fall to Edward's son, a young king destined to become one of the most powerful rulers of his age. That king was Athelstan, and under his reign, England would not only be forged, but tested in the fires of destiny. Athelstan and the making of England. When Edward the Elder died in 924, he left behind a kingdom that was united in name, but still fragile in spirit. His death marked the end of one generation's struggle and the beginning of another's destiny. In the shadows of his passing stood his son Athelstan, a young man whose claim to the throne was uncertain and whose future seemed precarious. His mother had not been Edward's queen, but one of his concubines, a fact that the nobles of Wessex were quick to exploit in questioning his legitimacy. Yet fate, as history often shows, cares little for the purity of bloodlines. What mattered was not how Athelstan was born, but what he would become, and in time he would rise to be remembered as the first true king of all the English, a ruler whose vision extended far beyond the frontiers his ancestors had known. Athelstan's early years were spent in Mercia, under the care of his aunt Ethelfald, the Lady of the Mercians. From her, he absorbed more than just the art of rule. He inherited a way of seeing the world. Ethelflaud's leadership had been shaped by balance, strength and compassion, courage and diplomacy. Under her influence, Athelstan grew into a prince who understood that leadership was not only about the sword, but about the soul of a people. He witnessed firsthand the slow knitting together of lands once divided by war, and he saw how alliances, faith, and vision could turn fragile unity into something enduring. By the time Ethelfald died, Athelstan had already begun to sense his destiny, to take his grandfather Alfred's dream and bring it to completion. When Athelstan claimed the throne, he did so not by divine right, but through sheer will. The nobles of Wessex were cautious, some even hostile, but his support among the Mercians was unshakable. He was crowned in Kingston upon Thames in 925, a symbolic place that straddled the borders of Wessex and Mercia, a perfect reflection of the unity he sought to embody. It was not a peaceful coronation. Tensions simmered, old rivalries resurfaced, and enemies watched from the shadows. Yet Athelstan faced these challenges with a calm resolve that would define his reign. He was not content to inherit a kingdom. He intended to transform it. From the beginning, Athelstan's vision was expansive. He was not merely a regional ruler. He saw himself as a monarch of a greater whole. He pursued alliances and enforced oaths that bound together the disparate regions of England. His authority stretched across Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and even into the lands that had once been dominated by Norse kings. But where his predecessors had been content to secure the south, Athelstan's eyes turned northward to Northumbria, the last great stronghold of Viking power in England. Northumbria was a land of stark beauty and fierce independence, ruled by Norse jarls who had little interest in bowing to a Saxon king. Yet Athelstan was determined to bring them into his fold, not through endless war, but through the same blend of strategy and conviction that had guided his forebears. In 927, his moment came. The death of the Norse king Sitric of York left Northumbria in a state of uncertainty. Athelstan seized the opportunity. He marched north with an army, his banners gleaming against the wind, and entered York not as a destroyer, but as a unifier. He was received with cautious respect, and through a mixture of negotiation and demonstration of strength, Northumbria submitted to his rule. For the first time in history, the entire English realm from the southern shores of Wessex to the northern walls of Scotland was united under one crown. The chroniclers recorded this moment with awe. So was Athelstan the first king of all the English, and the lord of all Britain. But Athelstan's ambition did not end with borders. He sought to craft not merely a larger kingdom, but a stronger one that could stand alongside the great powers of Europe. He reformed law and governance, building upon the foundations his grandfather had laid. His laws were remarkably progressive for their time, emphasizing justice, the protection of the poor, and the regulation of trade and coinage. He demanded accountability from his nobles, and sought to bring a sense of moral order to the realm. The king saw himself as God's chosen guardian of the English people, and he ruled with a sense of divine mission that blended piety with pragmatism. Athelstan was also deeply invested in learning and faith. His court became a beacon of intellectual and spiritual life, attracting scholars and monks from across Europe. He maintained close ties with the church, viewing it as both a moral compass and a stabilizing force in his expanding realm. He corresponded with continental rulers, arranged marriages for his sisters with European princes, and cultivated a network of influence that extended from the Frankish kingdoms to the courts of the north. Under his rule, England began to emerge from isolation, finding its place in the wider tapestry of medieval Christendom. Yet unity and ambition come at a cost. A submission of the northern lords was tenuous at best, and beyond the Scottish border, the kings of Alba and the lords of Strathclyde watched with unease. They saw in Athelstan's growing power not the promise of peace, but the threat of domination. Alliances formed in the north, an uneasy coalition of Scots, Vikings, and Welsh princes who sought to challenge the English king's might. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic confrontations in early English history, the Battle of Brunanburh. The battle came in 937, and its memory would echo through centuries of song and legend. The coalition army was vast, led by Constantine, king of Alba, Olaf Guthfrithson, the Norse king of Dublin, and Owen of Strathclyde. They marched south, determined to shatter Athelstan's fragile unity. Athelstan met them with his own forces seasoned warriors from every corner of England, bound not by tribal loyalty, but by a new sense of shared identity. For the first time, men fought not as West Saxons or Mercians, but as Englishmen. The battle was fierce and bloody, fought across the rugged northern landscape. Chronicles tell of the ground running red with blood, of shields shattered and swords dulled from endless strikes. It was not merely a contest of armies, but a struggle for the soul of a nation. At its heart stood Athelstan himself, calm and resolute, commanding with precision and faith. When the dust settled, it was England that stood victorious. The coalition was broken, its leaders scattered, and Athelstan's supremacy confirmed. The poem written in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle to commemorate the victory calls Brunanburh the Great Battle, where the sons of Edward won glory everlasting. It is no exaggeration to say that at Brunanburh, England was truly born. Before that moment, unity had been a political arrangement, a fragile bond held together by treaties and oaths. After Brunanburh, it became something far more powerful, a shared identity forged in struggle, sanctified in blood, and immortalized in memory. After the victory, Athelstan's rule entered its golden years. His authority was unquestioned, his kingdom secure. But he did not rule as a tyrant basking in conquest. Instead, he governed with restraint, understanding that true power lay not in domination, but in cohesion. His vision of kingship was remarkably modern. He saw himself as both protector and servant of his people, entrusted by God to uphold justice and peace. He continued to strengthen ties with the continent, exchanging gifts and letters with rulers as distant as Otto the Great of Germany and Hugh the Great of France. England, once a patchwork of warring kingdoms, was now respected as a unified and sophisticated realm. When Athelstan died in 939, he left behind a legacy so profound that later generations struggled to measure it. He had turned his grandfather's fragile dream into a living nation. Under him, England had found its borders, its law, its identity, and its voice. The chroniclers wrote that no king had ruled a greater realm in Britain, and for once their words were not mere flattery. His reign marked the moment when England ceased to be an idea and became a fact, one that would endure for 1,000 years. And yet, like all human endeavors, his achievement was not immune to time. After his death, the unity he had forged began to waver. The old forces of ambition, rivalry, and rebellion stirred once more. The Vikings were not finished, nor were the Scots content to live under English shadow. The next generations would struggle to preserve what Athelstan had built, learning that forging a nation is one challenge, but keeping it whole is another entirely. Still, Athelstan's light never dimmed. To this day, historians remember him as the first true king of England, the ruler who transformed the vision of Alfred the Great into reality. In his time, England became more than a land of warriors and fortresses. It became a nation of law, faith, and purpose. The dream that began with a few scattered tribes on the edge of a darkened world had, at last, taken shape under a single crown. The island that had known centuries of conquest and chaos now stood, however briefly, as one. The shadows of unity. England after Athelstan. When Athelstan's reign came to its end in 939, England stood at the height of its unity and glory. For the first time, a single monarch ruled from the southern shores of Kent to the storm-lashed frontiers of Northumbria. The dream that had flickered in the hearts of Alfred and Edward had finally become reality. Yet, as the old saying goes, the brighter the flame, the darker the shadow it casts. The death of Athelstan was not only the passing of a king, but the turning of a tide. His vision had bound together a nation, but his strength had been the thread that held it tight. And when that thread was gone, the fragile weave of unity began to loosen. The first signs of unraveling appeared almost immediately. The North, always restless, always watching, sensed opportunity. Athelstan's half-brother, Edmund, ascended to the throne, young and untested. The Vikings of Dublin, led by Olaf Guthferthson, who had once fought Athelstan and been driven into exile, saw their moment to strike. Within months, Olaf landed in the north with a great fleet, and the people of York, long resentful of southern rule, opened their gates to him without a fight. Northumbria, that eternal borderland between English order and Norse freedom, once again slipped from the crown's grasp. Edmund, though still in his youth, proved to be a ruler of surprising resolve. The blood of Alfred ran deep in him, and though he lacked Athelstan's grandeur, he possessed a quiet tenacity that England desperately needed. For years, he waged a careful war, part diplomacy, part strategy, part faith. He reclaimed the Midlands, built alliances, and eventually confronted the Viking forces head-on. By 944, after years of struggle, York was once again brought under English rule, and Olaf's dream of reclaiming Northumbria faded into legend. The victory did not restore the effortless unity of Athelstan's time, but it reaffirmed something deeper, England's survival instinct. The kingdom had become resilient, capable of enduring storms without breaking. Yet the challenges Edmund faced were not only on the battlefield. Within his own court, the balance between kingship and nobility was shifting. The English monarchy had grown strong under Alfred and Athelstan, but its foundation rested upon the loyalty of powerful earls and the blessing of the church. As the kingdom expanded, so did the ambitions of those who governed its regions. The lords of Mercia, the aldermen of Wessex, and the noble families of the north began to see themselves not merely as servants of the crown, but as powers in their own right. The king was still the heart of the realm, but the arteries were growing thick with competing interests. In the midst of these tensions, Edmund sought to bind the kingdom not only through war, but through faith and law. His charters and decrees continued the work of his predecessors, strengthening justice, standardizing coinage, and protecting monastic lands. He was deeply pious, a man who saw divine purpose in kingship, and he supported the church as both a spiritual and political ally. Monasteries, which had been ravaged in earlier centuries, began to flourish again, serving as centers of learning and administration. The monasteries of Glastonbury and Abingdon became symbols of this renewal, their influence spreading far beyond their stone walls. It was in this atmosphere that a new generation of churchmen men like Dunstan of Glastonbury would begin to emerge, shaping not only the religion, but the politics of the coming age. But fate, as ever, had little mercy for kings. In 946, at a feast in Puckelchurch, Edmund was murdered, cut down in his prime, by an outlaw he had banished. His death shocked the realm, not only for its violence, but for its timing. England, still reeling from decades of war and still fragile in unity, had lost a steady hand. The throne passed to his younger brother Edred, a man of frail health but strong spirit. Though he could not wield a sword with his brother's vigor, Edred ruled with a mind sharpened by experience and guided by counsel. Edred's reign would test the endurance of Athelstan's legacy yet again. Northumbria, ever the restless province, rebelled once more and called upon Eric Bloodaxe, the exiled Norse king of Norway, to rule over them. Eric was a warrior of the old world, fierce, proud, and utterly ruthless. His rule was a defiant act of rebellion against southern authority, a final echo of the Viking age that refused to die quietly. For nearly a decade, Northumbria wavered between English kings and Norse warlords, its loyalties shifting like the tide. Edred responded not with brute force, but with patience and persistence. He starved his enemies of support, cut their alliances apart, and in time, his strategy succeeded. Eric Bloodaxe was betrayed and slain, and in 954, the last Viking king of York fell. For the first time, all of England was firmly under English rule. The Viking Age, at least in England, had come to its close. With Northumbria secured, Edred turned inward, focusing on strengthening the kingdom's administration. His court, guided by reformers like Dunstan, sought to impose moral and spiritual order upon the realm. The monasteries grew in power, the church gained influence, and a vision of Christian kingship took deeper root. But as the crown became intertwined with religion, new tensions brewed beneath the surface, between the sacred and the secular, the old pagan spirit that lingered in the land and the new Christian orthodoxy that sought to define it. England, though united politically, remained divided in soul. After Edred's death in 955, the crown passed to his nephew, Eadwig, a young and impulsive ruler whose reign would reveal the growing cracks in the unity that Athelstan had forged. Eadwig's disputes with the church became legendary. He was accused of arrogance, indulgence, and scandalous behavior. Stories tell of his deserting his own coronation feast to pursue a woman, an act that outraged the clergy and led to his excommunication by Dunstan. Whether these tales were true or exaggerated, they symbolized a deeper struggle between royal authority and ecclesiastical power. England was changing. Its kings were no longer warrior saints, but men caught between the demands of power, faith, and human desire. Eadwig's short reign gave way to that of his brother, Edgar the Peaceful, whose rule would bring a brief but shining calm. Under Edgar, the land prospered. Trade flourished across the seas. Law and order were maintained, and for the first time in generations, England experienced a sustained peace. His nickname, the Peaceful, was not a sign of weakness, but of mastery. He commanded such authority that even the kings of Scotland and Wales came to his court in acknowledgment of his supremacy. The image of Edgar being rowed down the River Dee by 8 sub-kings became a powerful symbol of English unity and royal majesty. Yet even in peace, the seeds of future strife were being sown. The stability of Edgar's reign masked deep undercurrents of tension. The great monasteries, revived under his patronage, became political centers in their own right, and their wealth began to rival that of noble estates. The balance between church and crown, once a partnership, began to tilt uneasily. Meanwhile, the Viking world beyond England's shores was stirring once again. In Denmark and Norway, ambitious warlords were rising, men who dreamed not only of raiding but of ruling. The Northmen had been driven out of England, but they had not been defeated in spirit. When Edgar died in 975, the realm once more found itself without firm direction. His young sons, Edward and Fellard, became pawns in a deadly game between factions of nobles and churchmen. The struggle ended in tragedy when Edward, later known as Edward the Martyr, was murdered under mysterious circumstances at Corfe Castle. The young Fellard, barely a child, was placed on the throne. His epithet, the Unready, would one day become infamous, but in truth, it was not he who was unready, it was England itself. The unity that had been built through blood, faith, and vision was beginning to crack under the weight of its own contradictions. By the end of the 10th century, England stood at a crossroads. It was wealthy, organized, and more culturally advanced than it had ever been. Yet its strength had bred complacency. Its leaders were divided, its defenses weakened, and its sense of divine favor faltered. Beyond the horizon, the sea carried whispers of a familiar menace. The Vikings were returning, this time not as scattered raiders, but as kings in waiting. The age of Alfred, Edward, and Athelstan had built the House of England. Now, the storms that once raged outside its walls were gathering once more, ready to test the strength of what had been built. The Second Viking Age, England under siege history, as it often does, repeats itself, not in perfect cycles, but in haunting echoes that reach across generations. By the dawn of the 11th century, England had known almost a century of fragile peace and careful unity. The kingdom built by Alfred and solidified by Athelstan had become one of the wealthiest and most orderly realms in Europe. Its monasteries gleamed with gold and learning, its fields yielded abundant harvests, and its trade routes reached from the cold shores of Scandinavia to the warm harbors of the Mediterranean. But prosperity, for all its blessings, has a dangerous way of softening vigilance. And as the English grew comfortable, far to the north, old power stirred once more in the dark waters of the North Sea. The Vikings had never truly disappeared. Though driven out of English lands, their descendants ruled vast territories across Scandinavia, and their ambitions had grown alongside their kingdoms. Denmark, under the rule of powerful kings like Harald Bluetooth and his son Sweyn Forkbeard, had transformed from a loose confederation of tribes into a centralized and aggressive state. These were no longer the wild raiders of the 9th century, acting out of hunger or desperation. They were rulers commanding fleets and armies, guided by strategy, ambition, and revenge. And at the heart of their gaze was England, the rich, divided, and tempting prize that their ancestors had once ravaged. In 991, the storm finally broke. On the coast of Essex, near a small town called Nalden, a Viking fleet landed, led by a warlord named Olaf Tryggvason, one of the most feared and charismatic figures of his age. The English, led by the brave but ill-fated Alderman Byrhtnoth, met them in open battle. The fight that followed would become one of the most famous in Anglo-Saxon legend, immortalized in the Battle of Nalden, a poem that captured both the courage and the folly of the English defense. Byrhtnoth, driven by a sense of honor, allowed the Vikings to cross a narrow causeway to face him in fair combat, rather than holding them off while they were trapped on the other side. His chivalry, though noble, proved fatal. The Vikings overran his forces, Byrhtnoth was slain, and England suffered a humiliating defeat. What followed marked a dark turn in English history. King Thellard, still young and uncertain, faced a realm reeling from shock. In his desperation to buy peace, he resorted to an old and poisonous strategy. Danegeld a tribute of gold paid to the invaders in exchange for their withdrawal. It was meant as a quick solution, a way to prevent further destruction. But instead, it revealed weakness. The Vikings took the silver, left, and soon returned for more. Each payment only encouraged another attack. England became a land held hostage by its own wealth, forced to ransom itself again and again. The raids intensified, spreading across the coasts and rivers. Cities like London, Southampton, and Canterbury burned. Monasteries that had survived centuries of turmoil were plundered once more. The countryside was ravaged, its people enslaved or slain. Yet, through the chaos, a grim pattern emerged. The Viking attacks were no longer random. They were part of a larger campaign, a methodical effort to destabilize and dominate. Behind it all stood Sweyn Forkbeard, the king of Denmark, whose ambition reached far beyond raiding. Sweyn sought to conquer, not just plunder, and to make himself ruler of both Denmark and England. Thelred's government, paralyzed by indecision and mistrust, struggled to respond. The king's advisors were divided, his armies disorganized, and his alliances fragile. In 1002, in a moment of desperation and rage, Thelred made a fateful decision. Believing that he could end the Viking threat by eliminating their kin within his borders, he ordered the massacre of all Danes living in England, a brutal act that became known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre. It was a moment of horror that would stain his reign forever. Entire communities were slaughtered, including women and children, many of whom had lived peacefully in England for generations. The massacre did not bring safety. It brought vengeance. Among the dead was, allegedly, Sweyn Forkbeard's own sister. The response was swift and merciless. In 1003, Sweyn launched a full-scale invasion of England, not as a raider, but as a conqueror. His fleets swept across the coasts, burning and looting, but now with the clear goal of breaking English resistance entirely. The English defenses crumbled, and within a few years, nearly every region had been devastated. Thelred fled to Normandy, seeking refuge at the court of his brother-in-law, Duke Richard. For the first time since the days of Alfred, the English crown was without a king on its soil. In 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard was proclaimed King of England, the first foreign ruler to claim the entire realm. His reign, however, was short-lived. Within a year, he was dead, leaving his empire in the hands of his young son, Canute. What followed was one of the most extraordinary reversals in medieval history. Thellard returned from exile, attempting to reclaim his throne with Norman support. The country, weary of war and divided by loyalties, was thrown into yet another cycle of conflict. Canute, though young, proved to be no ordinary invader. He was calm, intelligent, and ruthlessly pragmatic. When Thellard died in 1016, his son Edmund Ironside took the throne, determined to defend England with all his strength. The war between Edmund and Canute raged across the land, culminating in the brutal Battle of Issanden. There, after a day of fierce fighting, Edmund's forces were defeated. In a remarkable moment of diplomacy, rather than continuing the bloodshed, the two kings agreed to divide the realm. Edmund would rule the south, and Canute the north. But fate intervened once again within months. Edmund was dead. Whether by illness or assassination, no one knew for certain. Canute now stood as the undisputed ruler of all England. Under Canute, something remarkable happened. What began as a conquest turned into one of the most stable and prosperous reigns in English history. Canute ruled not as a foreign oppressor, but as a true king of England. He married Laurid's widow, Emma of Normandy, uniting the old English royal line with his own, and sought to reconcile the people he had conquered. He maintained English laws, respected the church, and filled his court with both English nobles and Danish warriors. In a few short years, he transformed from invader to statesman, forging a North Sea empire that stretched from England to Denmark and Norway. Yet even Canute's greatness could not outlast the inevitability of time. When he died in 1035, his empire fractured. His sons, Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut, struggled for power, and old divisions reopened. England's brief Scandinavian age came to an end not with conquest, but with confusion. In 1042, the crown returned to an Englishman, Edward, known later as the Confessor. His ascension was hailed as a restoration of native rule, but it was also the beginning of new uncertainty. Edward's reign would mark the twilight of the Anglo-Saxon world. Though deeply pious and gentle in spirit, he lacked the political strength to control his ambitious nobles, particularly the powerful Godwin family of Wessex. The realm, though rich and orderly, was now a web of rivalries and alliances. Beyond the Channel, in Normandy, another figure was watching: the Duke of Normandy, a distant cousin of Edward, who believed that he had been promised the English throne. His name was William, and his ambition would soon bring about one of the most dramatic turning points in history. As the sun set on the first half of the 11th century, England stood at the height of its cultural brilliance, yet on the edge of catastrophe. The long struggle against the Vikings had forged a nation resilient and proud, but also weary and vulnerable. The seas that had once carried raiders would soon carry armies again, not from the cold north this time, but from across the southern horizon. The next invaders would not come to burn and leave. They would come to stay. The age of the Anglo-Saxons, centuries in the making, was drawing toward its fateful end. The Norman shadow, the invasion that changed England forever by the middle of the 11th century. England stood as one of the most prosperous kingdoms in Europe, a land forged from centuries of war, faith, and survival. The wounds of the Viking invasions had begun to heal, trade thrived once more, and the countryside was filled with the quiet rhythm of villages rebuilding their lives. Yet beneath that fragile peace, the seeds of the next great storm had already been sown. It was a storm that would not merely shake the kingdom, it would end an era, sweep away its ancient rulers, and give birth to a new England. The man who would bring that storm had been watching from across the Channel, patient, calculating, and relentless. His name was William, Duke of Normandy. To understand the Norman conquest, one must first understand the strange, delicate bond between England and Normandy. The connection had been forged through blood and marriage decades earlier, when King Thellard, exiled during the Viking invasions, took refuge in Normandy and married Emma, the sister of the Norman duke. Their son, Edward the Confessor, had grown up among the Norman courts, speaking their language, praying in their chapels, and absorbing their culture. When Edward eventually became King of England in 1042, he brought with him a love for Norman order and refinement that did not sit well with his English nobility. To the great families of England, the powerful Godwins, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, Edward's Norman sympathies felt like betrayal. Edward's reign, though outwardly peaceful, was a tapestry of tension. He was gentle, devout, and contemplative, more suited to the quiet of monasteries than the ruthlessness of kingship. His piety earned him respect, but his indecisiveness left his realm vulnerable. Power in England increasingly fell into the hands of one family, the Godwins of Wessex, led by Earl Godwin, a man of immense influence and ambition. Through shrewd marriages and political maneuvering, the Godwins became the true masters behind the throne. When Godwin died, his mantle passed to his son, Harold Godwinson, a man whose courage and intelligence would make him both England's greatest defender and its tragic hero. Meanwhile, across the sea, Duke William of Normandy had risen from a childhood of chaos to become one of the most formidable rulers in Europe. The bastard son of Robert the Magnificent, William had survived assassination attempts, rebellions, and betrayals. He had built Normandy into a disciplined and loyal state, his rule defined by iron will and ruthless precision. Unlike the quarrelsome lords of France, William demanded obedience, and he got it. By the 1050s, his eyes turned toward England, where his old friend and supposed ally, King Edward, now ruled. Edward had no children, and rumors swirled that he had promised William the English throne, in gratitude for Norman support during his years of exile. Whether that promise was ever truly made remains uncertain, but William believed it was, and that belief would shape the destiny of two nations. In 1064, Harold Godwinson crossed the Channel, perhaps shipwrecked, perhaps on a diplomatic mission, and found himself in William's court. What happened next is cloaked in legend. Norman chroniclers claimed that William treated Harold with honor, only for Harold to swear a sacred oath of loyalty to him, promising to support William's claim to the English throne. English accounts, however, insisted that Harold made no such promise, or that the oath was forced. Whatever the truth, William would later use that moment as a weapon and oath sworn over holy relics, later broken by Harold, a betrayal to be avenged. When King Edward the Confessor died in January 1066, the question of succession tore through England like wildfire. The Witenagemot, Mote, the Council of English Nobles, met swiftly and chose Harold Godwinson as king, a decision rooted in pragmatism. Harold was English, capable, and beloved by his people. He had defended their lands from invaders and understood the realm's intricate politics. He was crowned in Westminster Abbey beneath the gleaming arches that Edward himself had built. For a brief moment, England seemed united again. But across the Channel, in Normandy, William's fury ignited. He saw Harold's coronation not as destiny fulfilled, but as treachery. To him, Harold was not a king, but a usurper who had broken a holy oath. And William swore that he would come to England not as a friend, but as God's instrument of justice. As summer turned to autumn, William began assembling one of the greatest invasion forces the medieval world had ever seen. The harbors of Normandy filled with ships, hundreds of them, carrying knights in gleaming mail, archers, and infantry. Armor was polished, banners stitched with crosses. Priests blessed the cause, and word spread across Europe that this was not merely an invasion, but a holy war sanctioned by the Pope himself. William carried a banner blessed in Rome, marking his conquest as divinely ordained. To his men, they were not marauders, They were crusaders bringing order to a kingdom in rebellion against God's will. But as William prepared his fleet, fate tested Harold in the north. Another storm was brewing, this one born of blood and vengeance. Harald Hardrada, the mighty king of Norway and one of the last great Viking warriors, had also claimed the English throne, asserting that an ancient agreement gave him rights to it. In September 1066, he landed in northern England with a massive army, joined by Harold's own brother, Tostig, who had turned traitor. Harold Godwinson marched his forces north in a lightning campaign, covering nearly 200 miles in just 4 days. At Stamford Bridge, under the blazing sun, the English met the Norwegians in a battle of unimaginable ferocity. When it ended, the Viking Age itself ended with it. Harald Hardrada lay dead, Tostig with him, and the English emerged victorious but shattered. Their soldiers were exhausted, their armor dented, their strength spent. Barely had Harold's men wiped the blood from their blades when news came that froze their triumph into dread William had landed in the south. The Norman fleet had crossed the Channel unopposed, landing near Pevensey and Hastings. With disciplined precision, William fortified his position, built defenses, and began ravaging the countryside to lure Harold south. And so the king who had just defeated the last of the Vikings now turned to face the first of the Normans. The fate of England rested on what would happen next. On the morning of October 14th, 1066, the two armies met near Hastings. The English formed a shield wall. Atop Senlac Hill, thousands of warriors, locking their shields in a solid wall of oak and iron, unyielding against the tide. The Normans, arrayed below, advanced in waves of cavalry and archers. The battle raged for hours, brutal and chaotic. Arrows darkened the sky. Horses crashed against the English line. The cries of the dying echoed through the fields. 3 times the Normans attacked, and 3 times the English held. Then, in a moment of cunning, William feigned retreat. The English, believing the Normans were fleeing, broke formation to pursue them down the hill. That single mistake shattered their defense. William's cavalry wheeled around, cutting them down mercilessly. In the chaos that followed, an arrow perhaps by chance, perhaps by fate struck King Harold in the eye. The English standard fell. By nightfall, the last of the Anglo-Saxon kings was dead, and the age of England's independence was over. William claimed victory not as a conqueror, but as a chosen instrument of divine will. He marched on London, crushing resistance, and on Christmas Day 1066, he was crowned William the Conqueror in Westminster Abbey, the very place where Harold had been crowned less than a year before. The circle had closed, but the England he now ruled was not the same land of proud lords and ancient customs. It was a kingdom under new masters, its fate forever altered. The Norman conquest did not simply replace one ruler with another. It changed the very fabric of English society. The language, the laws, the architecture, the way of life, all began to shift under Norman rule. Castles rose where wooden halls once stood. The old Anglo-Saxon nobility was replaced by Norman barons. French words began to blend into English speech. A new elite emerged, half Frankish, half English, whose influence would shape the culture of Britain for centuries. The conquest was not only a military victory, but a quiet transformation of the soul of England itself. And yet, beneath that transformation, the memory of the old England lingered, the land of Alfred, Athelstan, and Harold, whose courage and ideals continued to whisper through the centuries. The Norman shadow had fallen, but it was under that shadow that a new light began to form. The England that rose from the ashes of 1066 was no longer the England of the Saxons or the Danes. It was the England of all of them combined. From blood and ruin came rebirth, and from conquest came creation. The Norman legacy, building a new England when William the Conqueror took the crown of England on that cold Christmas Day in 1066, the kingdom he had claimed was not yet his in truth. London bowed, but the rest of England smoldered in resentment. The Norman soldiers celebrated, but beyond the walls of their newly seized castles, the countryside waited in silence, wounded yet unbroken. To the Anglo-Saxon people, William was not their rightful king, but an invader, a foreigner who had come to strip them of their land, their language, and their freedom. And yet, through sheer force of will, meticulous planning, and ruthless efficiency, William would turn that conquered realm into one of the most sophisticated and centralized states in medieval Europe. The Norman conquest was not merely an event, it was the beginning of an entirely new order, one that reshaped every corner of English life, from the throne down to the plowman's field. The first challenge William faced was control. The English countryside was vast, its people proud and stubborn. The Saxon nobility, though shattered at Hastings, still possessed wealth, local influence, and the loyalty of their people. William understood that military victory alone would not secure his rule. He needed to break the power of the old elite and replace it with one loyal only to him. Over the next few years, he did just that with methodical precision. He seized the estates of the fallen English nobles and redistributed them among his Norman followers, men who had fought beside him at Hastings and whose loyalty was bound to him by blood and fortune. In this way, William rewrote the social map of England. By the end of his reign, almost every major estate in the kingdom was held by a Norman lord. The old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, once the backbone of English power, had vanished almost entirely. To secure this new hierarchy, William began building stone fortresses, symbols of dominance and instruments of control. Where once wooden halls had stood, now rose mighty castles of stone. The Tower of London, Windsor Castle, Durham, Rochester, and hundreds more. Each one was a statement of authority, a physical reminder that England had a new master. These fortresses were not only defensive structures, they were administrative centers, places from which Norman lords could enforce order, collect taxes, and watch over a restless population. The landscape of England changed forever, marked by towers and battlements that seemed to grow like iron roots into the soil. Yet William's rule was not maintained by fear alone. He was a pragmatist as much as a conqueror. While he displaced the English elite, he preserved the machinery of government that had made England efficient. The Anglo-Saxon system of shires and hundreds, the royal writs, the use of sheriffs, all remained. William recognized that the English had developed one of the most advanced administrative systems in Europe, and rather than destroy it, he adapted it. He combined Norman feudalism with English bureaucracy to create something entirely new, a hybrid system that gave him unprecedented control over both his lords and his subjects. Every lord held his land directly from the king, owing him military service and loyalty. But every freeman, too, was bound by the king's law, ensuring that no power, whether noble or common, existed beyond the reach of the crown. Despite this brilliant political engineering, rebellion simmered constantly. The English did not surrender their identity easily. Between 1067 and 1072, William faced numerous uprisings, some led by surviving Saxon nobles, others by common folk unwilling to bow to Norman rule. The most dangerous of these came from the north. The Earls of Northumbria and the descendants of the old Danelaw rose in open revolt, joined by Viking allies from Denmark. The rebellion was fierce, widespread, and deeply rooted in hatred for the Norman overlords. William responded with a campaign that would forever mark his reign in blood, the harrying of the North. In the winter of 1069 to 1070, William's armies marched north with fire and steel. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, livestock slaughtered. The land was left barren, and famine followed in their wake. Chroniclers wrote that the earth itself was poisoned by death, and that for years afterward, no living thing could thrive in those ruined fields. Tens of thousands perished. It was not merely a military suppression. It was an act of deliberate devastation, meant to crush resistance so completely that no one would dare to rise again. The harrying achieved its goal. The North lay silent, and England, for the first time, was truly subdued. But it was a victory bought with horror, and its scars would haunt the English soul for generations. Having secured his rule, William turned to organization and order. In 1085, near the end of his reign, he ordered one of the most extraordinary projects of the medieval world, the Domesday Book. This was no ordinary record, but a vast survey of the entire kingdom, meticulous inventory of every village, every manor, every acre of land, and every person who lived on it. Teams of royal commissioners traveled across England, questioning lords and peasants alike, recording who owned what, how much it was worth, and what taxes were owed. The result was a monumental book of power, a snapshot of a nation and a tool for control. Nothing like it existed anywhere in Europe. The English, with grim humor, called it the Doomsday Book because its judgments were final, like those of the last day. Through it, William could see the wealth of his kingdom as if from the throne of heaven itself. But even as William's power reached its height, his rule carried contradictions. He was both destroyer and builder, tyrant and reformer. Under his command, England became a bridge between two worlds, the old Germanic heritage of the Anglo-Saxons and the Latin civilization of continental Europe. The Normans brought with them not only soldiers, but scholars, architects, and priests. Monasteries flourished once more, built in the grand Romanesque style. Cathedrals of stone rose across the land, vast and awe-inspiring, Dorium, Ely, Winchester monuments, not only to faith, but to the permanence of Norman rule. The English church, too, was reshaped. The old clergy, many of whom had resisted Norman authority, were replaced with men loyal to William and the Pope. Latin became the language of administration, law, and religion. The English tongue retreated to the homes of peasants and the songs of minstrels, waiting centuries for its rebirth. Yet beneath this foreign dominance, a quiet fusion was taking place. The English did not forget who they were. The Normans, despite their arrogance, began to adapt to the land they had conquered. Intermarriage blurred distinctions. The children of Norman lords spoke both French and English. The rigid divisions of conqueror and conquered began to soften, giving rise to something entirely new, a shared identity that was neither purely Norman nor purely English. It was in this crucible of conquest and adaptation that England as a nation truly began to take shape. William himself remained a figure of awe and fear until his death in 1087. In his final years, he ruled a kingdom transformed but restless. His sons quarreled, his nobles schemed, and his once mighty body, grown heavy and scarred from decades of war, began to fail him. He died in Normandy, not in his beloved England, after a campaign gone wrong. As his body was prepared for burial, his attendants discovered that even in death he commanded terror. When they tried to lower him into his tomb, his swollen corpse burst, an ugly reminder of the mortality of kings. The scent drove away mourners, leaving only silence. The conqueror who had reshaped England had finally fallen, undone by the same frailty that humbles all men. But William's legacy endured. The England he left behind was unrecognizable from the one he had conquered 2 decades earlier. It was a realm bound together by law, fortified by stone, and ordered under a single unchallengeable crown. The feudal system he established would dominate English society for centuries. The castles he built would define its skyline. The administrative reforms he set in motion would become the foundation of English governance. And the fusion of Norman and Anglo-Saxon culture would give birth to a language, a people, and eventually an empire that would shape the world. The Norman conquest had begun as a tragedy, a story of invasion, loss, and submission, but its aftermath became the beginning of something far greater. The England that emerged from William's iron rule was stronger, more unified, and more ambitious than ever before. It would no longer be a land defined by isolation or tribal division. It was now part of the European world, a nation standing on the edge of power, ready to face the centuries ahead. The rise of a kingdom. From conquered land to enduring power, the death of William the Conqueror did not end the Norman story. It merely began a new and uncertain chapter. England, the land he had so forcefully bent to his will, stood at a crossroads. The great conqueror's shadow still loomed large, but his sons and grandsons would now have to navigate a kingdom built on conquest and sustained by fragile unity. The crown of England, now encrusted with both Norman ambition and Saxon legacy, passed into hands that were both heirs and rivals, bound together by blood and betrayal. It was a new age for a young kingdom, a time of kings and crusaders, of rebellion and reform, of ambition that reached beyond the shores of the English Channel and into the heart of Europe and the Holy Land. When William died in 1087, his vast dominion was divided between his sons. Robert Curthose, the eldest, inherited Normandy, while William Rufus, the second son, took England. This division immediately created tension, for England and Normandy were two halves of a whole one, could not truly be ruled without the other. The two brothers distrusted one another, and their rivalry would define the early years of Norman England. William Rufus, known for his fiery temper and golden hair, ruled England with his father's iron hand, but none of his wisdom. He was brash, ambitious, and sometimes cruel. His court was filled with intrigue, his nobles restless, and his church wary of his arrogance. Yet despite his flaws, William Rufus continued his father's policy of consolidation. He strengthened the royal administration, built more castles, and expanded royal justice. But fate had little patience for his rule. In 1100, while hunting in the New Forest, a land his father had once cleared for sport, William Rufus was struck by an arrow. Whether by accident or design, no one knows. He died instantly, and the forest fell silent. The crown, still warm with the blood of a king, passed to his younger brother, Henry. Henry I, known to history as Henry Beauclerc for his education and intellect, brought to the throne something rare among medieval rulers: stability. He was shrewd, calculating, and above all, aware that England could no longer be ruled solely by fear. His reign marked a turning point, where the brutal conquest of William gave way to governance, reform, and the slow weaving together of two peoples. Henry understood that for the Norman dynasty to survive, it had to root itself in the English soil. He married Matilda of Scotland, a descendant of the old Anglo-Saxon royal line, uniting Norman and English blood in one royal household. This marriage was more than symbolic, it was political genius. It reassured the English nobility and commoners alike that the new dynasty was not merely a foreign imposition, but a legitimate continuation of their own heritage. Under Henry's rule, England became more orderly and efficient than ever before. He strengthened the system of royal justice, appointed capable administrators, and demanded loyalty, not through terror, but through law. His court became a center of governance rather than mere power. For the first time since the conquest, the idea of an English kingdom, not just a Norman realm, began to take root. The language of government remained French, but the soul of England was quietly returning. The sons of Norman lords were growing up speaking both tongues, marrying English women, and thinking of England as their home. The conquerors were slowly becoming the English themselves. But stability never lasts long in medieval Europe. Henry's later years were clouded by tragedy. His only legitimate son and heir, William Adelin, drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120. The ship, carrying the cream of the Anglo-Norman nobility, struck a rock off the coast of Normandy and sank. Nearly everyone aboard perished. Chroniclers wrote that no ship ever brought more misery to England. The grief-stricken king was left without a male heir, and this loss would plunge the realm into chaos upon his death. To secure his legacy, Henry named his daughter Matilda as his heir a bold move in an age where women were rarely seen as rulers. He made his nobles swear allegiance to her, but oaths made in peace are often forgotten in ambition. When Henry I died in 1135, the crown did not pass smoothly. His nephew Stephen of Blio seized the throne, claiming the support of the barons who were unwilling to accept a woman as their ruler. Thus began one of the darkest and most chaotic periods in English history, the Anarchy. For nearly 2 decades, England was torn apart by civil war between the supporters of Stephen and the forces of Empress Matilda. Castles burned, fields lay wasted, and law gave way to violence. Chroniclers described it as a time when Christ and his saints slept. The country that had once been bound together by Norman order descended into feudal anarchy. And yet, even amid this turmoil, the idea of monarchy strong, centralized, and sacred did not die. When the war finally ended, peace was restored not through battle, but through agreement. Stephen would rule until his death, but he would recognize Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, as his heir. When Stephen died in 1154, the young Henry ascended the throne as Henry II, bringing with him a new dynasty, new energy, and a vision that would transform England yet again. Henry, too, was one of the most remarkable rulers of the medieval world. Intelligent, restless, and fiercely determined, he inherited a kingdom exhausted by civil war and rebuilt it into a powerhouse of administration and law. Under his rule, England became not just a realm, but an empire. Through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and fascinating women in history, Henry gained vast territories in France, Aquitaine, Ganjou, and Normandy, making him ruler of more lands in France than the French king himself. The Plantagenet Empire stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. Yet with such power came endless challenges, rival kings, rebellious sons, and an ever-ambitious church. Henry's greatest achievement lay not in conquest, but in reform. He revolutionized English law, laying the foundations for what would become the common law system, based not merely on royal decree, but on precedent and justice. He sent royal justices across the land to hear cases, standardized procedures, and made the law a living institution that reached every corner of the realm. It was under Henry that England began to move toward a recognizable legal and political identity, one that valued order, rights, and accountability. The echoes of his reforms can still be felt today, centuries later. But power has its price. Henry's reign was marred by one of the most infamous events in English history, the murder of Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Once Henry's friend and ally, Becket had become his fiercest opponent in a struggle over the rights of the church versus the authority of the crown. Their conflict escalated until, in a moment of rage, Henry supposedly cried out, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights took his words literally, traveling to Canterbury and murdering Becket before the altar. The shock reverberated across Christendom. Henry was forced to do public penance, walking barefoot through the streets of Canterbury and allowing monks to lash him in atonement. The king who had sought to rule through law had been undone by his own anger. Despite his brilliance, Henry's later years were consumed by betrayal. His sons Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John rose against him, encouraged by their mother Eleanor. Family, the very thing that had given him strength, became his undoing. When he died in 1189, broken and betrayed, his empire was left in turmoil once again. Yet his legacy endured. Henry had built the foundations of English governance, law, and justice. He had turned the chaos of the Norman age into the structure of a nation. And so, from conquest to consolidation, from rebellion to reform, England had risen from the ashes of invasion to become something greater than any king could have imagined. The Norman bloodline had fused with the Saxon soul, producing a nation that was uniquely its own. The castles that once symbolized oppression now stood as monuments of endurance. The English language, long buried under the weight of French aristocracy, began to stir again, quietly reclaiming its voice. A new world was dawning, a kingdom ready to face crusades, plagues, and empires yet unborn. The England of Henry II was not merely surviving. It was ascending. It had moved beyond conquest and was now forging its identity, a land of kings and courts, of knights and commoners, of law and legend. The journey that began with fire and blood was now entering an age of stone and parchment, where the sword and the quill would shape the destiny of a people whose influence would one day reach across the world. The long shadow of power. As the Norman kings tightened their grip on England, their rule began to reshape not just the land, but the very identity of the English people. What had once been a country of many tribes and scattered loyalties was slowly being drawn into a single web of governance, faith, and feudal duty. Yet beneath this newly forged unity, the spirit of independence that had always defined the Anglo-Saxons did not vanish. It simmered quietly, hidden behind the stone walls of Norman castles and the quiet prayers whispered in English churches, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. England was changing, yes, but not in the way its conquerors imagined. The people who once resisted invasion now began to transform conquest into adaptation, bending the will of empire towards something uniquely their own. The Norman rulers had brought with them a vision of control that was far-reaching and absolute. Every village, every manor, every piece of farmland was now recorded in the Doomsday Book, a staggering achievement. That turned England into one of the most administratively advanced kingdoms in medieval Europe. To some, it was a symbol of oppression, a catalogue of taxes and servitude. But to others, it represented something new: order, accountability, and a strange kind of security. The English landscape, once wild and uncertain, was now governed by law, bound by the word of the king, and shaped by his vision. Yet even as this new system took hold, the human heart remained unpredictable. Power had brought peace, but it had also planted the seeds of rebellion. The Norman aristocracy lived lives of wealth and privilege, but their dominance came at a cost. The vast stone castles that rose across the countryside were not only fortresses of protection, they were symbols of fear. They reminded the English who truly ruled their land. But within those walls, cracks began to form. The Norman nobles, once united under William the Conqueror, now began to fight among themselves. Rivalries turned into plots. Alliances shifted like sand. The king's vision of a unified kingdom was constantly under threat, not from the English peasants, but from his own ambitious barons. The struggle for power was no longer between invader and native. It had become a contest among conquerors themselves. And while the nobility fought for power, the church stood as the quiet observer, and sometimes the ultimate judge. The influence of Rome reached deep into English life, guiding not only spiritual matters, but political ones as well. Bishops and abbots became power brokers, mediating between crown and people, using divine authority as a shield and a weapon. Cathedrals began to rise, grand monuments of stone and faith, built to last for centuries. Their spires pointed toward heaven, but their foundations were laid upon the sweat of English labor. Faith was the one force that united conqueror and conquered alike, offering hope in a world defined by hierarchy and struggle. It was in this fusion of cultures, Norman discipline and English endurance, that something remarkable began to emerge. A new language was born, a blend of Anglo-Saxon earthiness and Norman elegance. The Old English tongue, once the voice of farmers and warriors, evolved into something more refined, capable of poetry, law, and diplomacy. This linguistic transformation mirrored the deeper change in society itself. The English were no longer simply subjects. They were becoming a people again, reshaped, redefined, but unbroken. By the 12th century, the kingdom had matured into a formidable force. Trade began to flourish once more, linking English ports to the markets of France, Flanders, and beyond. The wooden huts of earlier centuries gave way to bustling towns, their streets filled with merchants, craftsmen, and scholars. England was not just surviving, it was thriving. Yet prosperity brought new questions. Who truly held the right to rule? The king, ordained by God, or the people, bound by ancient custom? This quiet tension would define the next chapter of England's destiny. As time passed, new generations grew up in a world where the memory of the conquest was fading. The children of Normans and Saxons no longer saw each other as enemies. Intermarriage had blurred old divisions, and loyalty to the English crown began to outweigh ties to distant Normandy. England was, at last, becoming its own nation, born from conquest, shaped by resilience, and guided by an unyielding belief in its own future. Yet, history has a way of repeating its lessons. Power, no matter how well built, always casts a shadow. And as England's kings looked outward toward Europe and the edges of the known world, they could not escape the truth that every empire eventually faces, that the seeds of greatness are often the same seeds that bring downfall. The birth of a nation's soul, the dawn of the 13th century, arrived with both brilliance and unease. England, now a powerful and unified kingdom, stood as a marvel of medieval governance and ambition. Yet beneath the shining image of royal authority and flourishing towns, tension simmered between crown, church, and people. What had been forged through conquest and discipline was now being tested by the weight of its own creation. The kings who once ruled with divine certainty now faced subjects who had begun to think differently, men who believed that power could be challenged, that justice should be shared, and that the voice of the commoner once silenced beneath the boots of knights might one day echo through the halls of history. The question was no longer whether England could survive, but what kind of nation it was becoming. King John, the youngest son of Henry II, would become the reluctant face of this transformation. History would remember him as a tyrant, a man whose greed, suspicion, and endless wars drained the realm of wealth and loyalty. But his reign also became the crucible in which a revolutionary idea began to take shape, that the power of kings must have limits. For centuries, English monarchs had ruled by divine right, unquestioned and absolute. John's failures changed that forever. His heavy taxes, failed military campaigns, and conflicts with the church left England exhausted. The barons who once fought under the royal banner began to rebel, demanding rights that would protect not just their own privileges, but the very idea of fairness in governance. And so, in the meadows of Runnymede in 1215, history took a quiet but seismic turn. Here, surrounded by banners, knights, and scribes, King John was forced to seal a document that would change the world, the Magna Carta. It was not yet democracy, nor even true freedom, but it was something far more powerful. A promise that no man, not even the king, was above the law. That justice was a right, not a gift. That the will of the few could no longer crush the lives of the many. For the first time, England had written down the idea that government should be accountable, a concept that would echo through the centuries, inspiring revolutions, constitutions, and the birth of modern liberty itself. But while the ink on the Magna Carta dried, the kingdom itself remained fragile. England was still a land of deep contrasts. Soaring cathedrals and mud-stained villages, knightly valor and peasant toil, poetry and famine. The countryside pulsed with life. Farmers plowing the fields, monks copying texts in candlelit abbeys, merchants traveling dusty roads to bustling markets. This was the true strength of England, not its kings or castles, but its people. Each one, in their own way, was helping to build a nation whose roots would one day stretch across the world. Yet, as peace slowly returned, the ambitions of the English crown turned outward once more. For beyond the white cliffs of Dover, the world was changing, and England could not remain still. The 13th and 14th centuries saw England drawn deeper into the affairs of Europe. Wars in France, alliances with Flanders, and rivalries with Scotland and Wales reshaped the political map. The kings of England dreamed not only of ruling their island, but of claiming a place among the great powers of Christendom. Edward I, known as the Hammer of the Scots, embodied this new ambition. A warrior king in the truest sense, he marched across Britain with the iron discipline of Rome itself. He built castles that still stand today, massive stone fortresses rising from the hills of Wales and the borders of Scotland, symbols of conquest and endurance. But even as he expanded England's reach, he also strengthened its heart. Under his rule, the first real parliament began to take shape, a gathering of nobles, clergy, and commoners, called not just to obey, but to advise. The idea that governance could be shared was no longer a dream. It was becoming a practice. This was the birth of something remarkable, the slow, deliberate shaping of England's political soul. The Magna Carta had planted the seed, and now it was beginning to grow. Law, once the weapon of kings, became the foundation of society. The courts expanded, judges traveled the realm, and justice, imperfect as it was, began to reach further into the lives of ordinary people. For the first time, the concept of English law became a national identity in itself, uniting regions and dialects under one shared system of order. In this, perhaps more than in war or conquest, England's genius was revealed, its ability to transform struggle into structure, chaos into code, rebellion into reform. And yet, history is never content to move in straight lines. Even as England flourished, the world around it began to darken. The 14th century would bring challenges unlike any before, plagues, famine, and war that would test the very soul of the nation. The Black Death, when it came, would sweep across England like a shadow from another world, killing millions, emptying towns, and silencing entire villages. Fields lay untended, churches unfilled, and families shattered. But from that devastation would rise something unexpected change. The scarcity of labor gave peasants new power. Wages rose, and with them came demands for better treatment, more rights, and a voice in the affairs of their rulers. The world that emerged from the plague was not the same as the one that had died. The old order had been shaken, and England, once again, began to transform. The long shadow of history stretched forward from this moment. From the fields of Runnymede to the cathedrals of Canterbury, from the thunder of war to the whispers of the common people, England had found something deeper than conquest or kingship. It had found its voice. It was a voice that questioned, that resisted, that dreamed of a fairer world. And though centuries of struggle still lay ahead, the foundation of a new kind of power had been laid, not the power of one ruler over many, but the power of a people shaping their destiny together. The echo of empires and the birth of England's legacy. The story of England's rise did not end with the kings who ruled or the battles they fought. It lived on in the minds of those who believed that history was not a chain binding them to the past, but a living fire carried forward from one generation to the next. As the 15th century dawned, the old medieval world began to crack open, revealing the faint glimmer of something new, a modern age waiting to be born. Yet the journey from feudalism to freedom would not come gently. It would be written in rebellion, reformation, and revelation, a centuries-long struggle to define not only what England was, but what it would become. When we look back at this time, we see not a single kingdom, but a nation standing at the edge of transformation. The long wars with France were drawing to a close. The 100 Years' War had drained England's wealth and blood, but it had also awakened something powerful, a sense of identity that went beyond kings or noble families. The English longbowmen who fought at Agincourt and Crecy were not aristocrats, but common men. They fought not for plunder or divine right, but for a country they had begun to call their own. It was here, amid the mud of distant battlefields, that the seeds of nationalism quietly took root. Yet even as England's armies returned home, its peace was shattered by the chaos of civil war. The Wars of the Roses, a bitter feud between the houses of Lancaster and York, tore the kingdom apart from within. Families divided, loyalties fractured, and once mighty cities were reduced to whispers of their former strength. The red rose and the white became symbols of ambition and revenge, as England devoured itself in the name of power. But even in this turmoil, something profound was taking shape. Through the ashes of aristocratic greed and endless betrayal, a new dynasty would rise, one that would bind the wounds of war and lead England into a new world. When Henry Tudor emerged victorious at Bosworth Field in 1485, it was more than the end of a battle. It was the end of an era. With his crown came a fragile peace, and with his lineage, the dawn of the Tudor age. Under the Tudors, England began to redefine its place in the world. The old feudal bonds gave way to a centralized state, guided by cunning diplomacy, ruthless ambition, and a vision that extended far beyond its shores. Henry VII brought stability, but it was his son, Henry VIII, who would set fire to the old order in ways no one could have imagined. The Reformation that followed was not merely a religious shift. It was an earthquake that split the soul of Europe. When Henry broke from Rome, declaring himself the head of the Church of England, he was not only defying the Pope, he was reshaping the very idea of sovereignty. No longer would England bow to the authority of distant powers. Its faith, like its crown, would now be its own. Monasteries were dissolved, treasures confiscated, and centuries of tradition swept aside. The old world, built on divine hierarchy, was gone. In its place stood a kingdom forged from defiance, one that would soon find strength not in conformity, but in diversity of thought and will. Under Elizabeth I, this transformation reached its golden age. The England of Shakespeare, Drake, and Raleigh was a world bursting with possibility, a nation looking outward, across oceans, and beyond horizons. The Elizabethan era was more than a time of artistic brilliance. It was the birth of global ambition. The same island that had once been invaded by Romans, Vikings, and Normans now sent its own ships to explore the world. The Atlantic became England's new frontier, and from the windswept docks of London, a maritime empire began to take shape. But even in its triumph, the lessons of history remained, the understanding that greatness born of conquest could not endure without unity, justice, and faith in something greater than power itself. The centuries that followed would test these ideals again and again. Civil war would return, this time between parliament and crown. Kings would fall, parliaments would rise, revolutions would erupt, and empires would expand. Yet through all of it, the echo of those early centuries, the age of warriors, kings, and commoners, continued to guide England's spirit. The Magna Carta's promise of liberty evolved into the foundation of democracy. The courage of ordinary people became the heart of its resilience. The quiet defiance of a once conquered island had transformed into the confident voice of a world power. But perhaps the true legacy of this story is not found in its victories, nor even in its survival, but in its transformation. From chaos to code, from conquest to culture, England had become more than a nation. It had become an idea that power can be checked by principle, that freedom can grow from the roots of hardship, that even the smallest island, if guided by conviction, can reshape the world around it. And as the sun set over the stone towers of Westminster and the green fields of its countryside, the England that had once fought for its very existence stood ready to face a new horizon, a horizon filled with industry, reason, and empire. The journey that began with warriors on muddy shores ended with scholars, explorers, and dreamers reaching for the edge of the world. The same restless spirit that had driven its earliest settlers and shielded its people from invasion now pushed them outward, to seek, to learn, to build. The story of how a warrior people forged the foundations of England is not merely a tale of battles or kings. It is a story of endurance, transformation, and vision, of a people who took the broken fragments of history and turned them into something lasting. A civilization built not on conquest alone, but on adaptation, imagination, and belief in a shared destiny. It is a reminder that even the most fragile beginnings can become the cornerstone of greatness. And so, the echo of that ancient world still lingers in the language we speak, the laws we follow, and the ideals we defend. From the fire-lit halls of the Saxons to the global stage of modern Britain, one truth endures, that the power of a nation lies not in the strength of its armies, but in the spirit of its people. The warriors who once crossed the cold seas to a distant island could not have known that they were founding something that would one day touch every corner of the earth. Yet through them, and through all who came after, the story of England became the story of the world.